To a young noblewoman standing at the threshold of power, admired for both her royal heritage and her growing wisdom, this work is offered with deep respect. Though her position is elevated by the greatness of her lineage, it is her intellect and character that promise an even greater future. The intention behind these words is not simply to praise the past, but to provide a foundation upon which something even stronger and more remarkable can be built. The deeds of those who came before her, her father and grandfather, are not presented in full detail, but rather carefully selected and shaped into a clear and engaging account. The purpose is not to overwhelm, but to illuminate. Through these stories one may find not only knowledge, but also a sense of direction, a quiet space for reflection, and even moments of calm in the midst of responsibility. Before turning to the great rulers themselves, it is important to first understand the people they once governed, the origins of a nation whose story stretches far into the uncertain past. The beginnings of the Saxons are surrounded by mystery. Time has blurred the truth, leaving behind only fragments of tradition and conflicting beliefs. Some claimed they came from the northern lands, linked to seafaring warriors of the cold seas. Others believed their roots reached back to the ancient world, to soldiers who once followed a great conqueror and scattered across distant lands after his death. Whatever their origin, one thing is certain. They were an ancient and formidable people, known and remembered long before their rise to power. What can be stated with great confidence is how they first arrived in the lands they would later dominate. They came by sea, landing on a distant shore that would become their first foothold. The inhabitants of that region were not welcoming. Conflict came quickly as the newcomers were met with resistance. Yet the Saxons did not retreat. They fought fiercely, securing their position and eventually forcing their enemies into negotiation. An agreement was reached. The Saxons were permitted to trade, but strict limits were placed upon them. They were not to settle permanently, nor were they to harm the local population. For a time, peace held. But peace without opportunity soon revealed its weakness. Without wealth or goods to exchange, the agreement brought little benefit to the newcomers. It was a fragile balance, waiting to collapse. A turning point came through an unexpected act. A young Saxon, adorned with gold yet lacking food, encountered a local man. In a moment that seemed almost absurd, he traded his gold not for riches, but for earth, mere soil gathered from the ground. To the onlookers it appeared foolish. To his own people it seemed madness. Yet the true meaning of this act soon became clear. The soil was spread across the land, marking a claim. Fortifications rose, simple at first but undeniable. What had been a symbolic exchange became a declaration of possession. The agreement had not been broken in words, but in spirit, it had been transformed. When the original inhabitants saw what had been done, anger replaced any sense of triumph they had once felt. War followed swiftly. This time, the Saxons were ready. Their discipline and preparation overcame the uncoordinated attacks of their enemies. Victory brought expansion, and expansion brought dominance. Over time, their position grew stronger, and their influence spread across the surrounding lands. At one decisive moment, deception played a crucial role. Under the pretense of peace, a meeting was arranged. One side arrived unarmed, trusting in negotiation. The other came prepared. Hidden weapons were revealed at the last possible moment, and the result was swift and final. Leadership was eliminated in a single strike, and resistance collapsed soon after. From that point forward, fear became as powerful as force in securing control. It is said that the very name of this people may have come from the weapons they carried. Long knives that became both their symbol and their legacy. Whether this is true or not, their reputation grew rapidly. Stories of their strength and their victories spread far beyond their homeland. Across the sea, another land faced growing danger. Once protected by a powerful empire, it now stood alone. Its defences, though impressive, could not compensate for a lack of strength and unity. Surrounded by enemies and unable to defend itself, its people searched desperately for aid. Hearing of the rising power of the Saxons, they sent envoys with a simple but urgent request. They offered land, wealth, and loyalty in exchange for protection. Their message was clear. Where others had failed, the Saxons might succeed. In their strength, they saw hope. The Saxon leaders answered the British appeal with a short but confident reply. Their message was clear. The Saxons would stand beside the Britons as loyal allies and would not abandon them in a time of danger. The envoys returned home carrying that promise, and their arrival filled their people with renewed hope. Soon afterward, the force that had been pledged crossed into Britain and was welcomed warmly by those who had called for help. Its impact was immediate. In a brief span of time, the invaders who had been ravaging the land were driven back, and the country was restored to those who lived there. The task itself was not especially difficult. The name of the Saxons had already spread fear ahead of them, and many who heard they were coming were shaken before battle had even begun. Enemies fled before the full weight of Saxon arms ever reached them. The chief opponents facing the Britons were the Scots and the Picts. While the Saxons fought against these enemies, the Britons supplied them with everything they needed. For a while, the arrangement seemed to benefit both sides. The Saxons stayed in the island and maintained the appearance of faithful friendship. But their commanders were observant men. They saw a land that was wide, rich, and fertile. They also saw a population that had little taste for war and little power to defend itself. At the same time, many among the Saxons had no secure homeland of their own. It did not take long for the idea of settlement to take shape. Messengers were sent back to summon more of their people. Once that larger design had formed, the balance changed. The Saxons made peace with the Scots and Picts, and together they turned against the Britons themselves. The former allies were pushed from their own lands, and the conquerors divided the territory among themselves. From then on, the island became linked to their name. In later generations, the people of that land would still be known by a name joining together, the Angles and the Saxons, preserving the memory of those migrations and conquests. There is much more that could be told about how these events unfolded in detail, about the leaders who directed them, and about the later conversion of those same peoples to Christianity. But the story now turns back to the line of events already set in motion elsewhere, where another struggle for power was beginning. After the death of the Frankish ruler Hugh, the kingdom faced an uncertain succession. He left behind no surviving male heir, recognised as legitimate, only a daughter named Amalberga, who had married Irminfrid, king of the Thuringians. Yet the Frankish people, remembering that Hugh had governed them with moderation and restraint, chose not to pass power through his daughter. Instead, they raised to the throne a son he had fathered by a concubine, a man named Theodric. Once established as king, Theodric moved carefully. He sent an embassy to Irminfrid, seeking peace and friendship rather than immediate conflict. The message delivered by the envoy was measured and respectful. Theodric did not wish to appear as a master claiming authority, but as a friend and kinsman seeking harmony. He asked only that Irminfrid refrain from creating division among the Franks, who had now chosen their own king. Irminfrid received the envoy with proper courtesy and answered in a way that matched his royal standing. He said he was pleased by the decision of the Frankish people and had no wish to stir up disorder where agreement already existed. Peace, he claimed, was his highest desire. Yet on the matter of the kingdom itself, he delayed a final answer and said he would speak only after consulting those closest to him. The envoy was treated honourably and kept at court for some time. But inside the palace, other voices were already at work. When Amalberga learned that her brother's embassy had come to discuss royal succession, she pressed her own claim through her husband. She argued that the right to the kingdom belonged to her by blood, since she was the lawful daughter of a king and queen. In her eyes, Theodric, born outside lawful marriage, stood beneath her and had no right to claim authority over Irminfrid. She found an eager ally in Iring, one of Irminfrid's most trusted companions. He was a bold and capable man, known for strength, intelligence, determination, and a talent for persuasion. These qualities had earned him the king's confidence, and now he used them to guide Irminfrid toward defiance. Irminfrid called together his leading men and closest advisers and laid before them the words of the Frankish envoy. Most of them urged caution. They believed peace and agreement offered the safest course, especially since Irminfrid could not easily withstand a Frankish assault, while facing danger on another frontier as well. But Iring, driven by ambition and by the Queen's demands, urged the opposite. He argued that Irminfrid should not yield. According to this view, the Thuringian king possessed the stronger claim, and his realm, his forces, his arms, and his resources were enough to stand against Theodric. Influenced by this counsel, Irminfrid sent back a proud and cutting reply. He said that he did not deny a bond of friendship or kinship, but he couldn't understand how a man not fully worthy of freedom could already speak as though he held power over others. How, he asked, could such a man pretend to rule him? The insult was unmistakable. The envoy, deeply angered, answered that he would rather lose his own life than hear such words, spoken lightly, knowing how much Frankish and Thuringian blood would be spilled because of them. Then he departed and returned to Theodric, reporting everything exactly as he had heard it. Theodric did not explode in rage. Instead, he concealed his anger beneath calm words and cold restraint. He replied with bitter irony, saying it seemed necessary to hurry and serve Irminfrid, so that after losing liberty, at least life might somehow be preserved. Then he advanced toward the Thuringian frontier with a large army. There, at a place called Runebergen, he found Irminfrid waiting with forces no less formidable. Battle followed, and for 2 days the outcome remained uncertain. On the 3rd day, the struggle finally broke in Theodric's favour. Irminfrid was defeated and fled with what remained of his army to a fortified stronghold called Scheidungen on the river Unstrut. After the battle, Theodric gathered his senior officers and commanders and asked what course should be taken next. Some urged caution. One advisor argued that the army had suffered too heavily to continue at once. The dead had to be buried, the wounded cared for, and new forces raised before any further advance could be made. Too many thousands had already fallen, he said, and the remaining strength might not be enough if fresh enemies rose up on every side. In his view, the safest path was to return home, regroup, and prepare for a later campaign. But another voice carried great weight with Theodric. This was a clever slave whose judgment the king had often tested and often found reliable. Familiarity had given him unusual access, and when asked for his opinion he spoke with confidence. He argued that honourable undertakings must not be abandoned once begun. Great ancestors had not turned back from hard tasks, and the present struggle, he said, was no greater than those older victories won by smaller forces against stronger enemies. Now that the land lay open and the enemy had been beaten, withdrawal would only hand hope back to the defeated. The wish to return home and see familiar faces was understandable, but it depended on the enemy remaining weak and inactive, something no prudent commander should assume. He continued by pointing out that although many had died, the enemy had suffered just as terribly. Their king was no longer riding proudly at the head of an army, but hiding inside a fortress like a hunted creature. He still possessed wealth and influence, enough perhaps to bring in support from other peoples, and though his forces were presently broken, time would restore them if given the chance. The place of victory, he warned, should never be surrendered by the victor. Nor could every stronghold already taken be securely held if the army withdrew. Delay would allow old gains to slip away before the campaign could even be resumed. That argument carried the day. Theodrich and those hungry for complete victory decided to remain in the field. Then word was sent to the Saxons, who had long been fierce enemies of the Thuringians. The proposal was simple and tempting. If the Saxons helped defeat Irminfrid and seize his fortress, the land would be granted to them as a lasting possession. The response came quickly. The Saxons sent 9 commanders, each connected with 1,000 fighting men. These leaders entered Theodric's camp with a smaller escort, while the larger body of their warriors remained outside. They greeted Theodrich in peace, and he received them gladly. Hands were joined, terms were discussed, and Theodrich laid out the situation in full. The Saxon commanders then gave their answer. They declared that the people who had sent them were devoted to Theodric and ready to follow his commands. Whatever he required, they said, they were prepared to do. They would crush his enemies if fortune allowed it, or die beside him if fate demanded that instead. Victory or death, in their words, were the only outcomes worthy of Saxon warriors. No greater gift could be offered to allies than a willingness to cast aside fear of death for their sake. And that promise, they said, would soon be proven not in words, but on the field itself. When the Saxon envoys finished speaking, the Frankish court was left staring at them with a mixture of admiration and unease. Their size alone made an impression, but it was not only their physical presence that unsettled those around them. Everything about them seemed hard, foreign, and severe. Their clothing was simple and martial, their long spears held with easy familiarity, their small shields resting at hand, and the heavy knives strapped behind them gave the impression of men who had come into the world prepared for violence. Their hair fell long over their shoulders, and their faces showed none of the uncertainty or hesitation that often appears in men serving under another ruler. What stood out most was not their dress or weapons, but the force of their spirit. They looked like men who could not easily be bent, frightened, or commanded against their will. That impression immediately created doubt among some of the Franks. There were voices in the camp warning that allies of this kind might someday become a greater threat than the enemy they had been summoned to fight. A people so stubborn, so warlike, and so difficult to restrain, they argued, should not be invited too deeply into lands others hoped to keep. If such men were ever allowed to settle permanently in the territory under dispute, they might one day turn their strength against the very kingdom that had called on them. But Theodrich was focused on the demands of the moment, not on distant dangers. He needed victory now, and he believed these men could deliver it. Trusting in their strength, he ordered them to prepare an assault on the fortress. The Saxons withdrew from the king's presence and established their camp on the southern side of the stronghold, in the meadows beside the river. At first light the next morning, they armed themselves and moved at once against the outer defences. They struck hard, stormed the forward works, and set them ablaze. Once the outer line had fallen and the flames had spread, they gathered themselves in a dense formation before the eastern gate of the main fortress. The defenders on the walls understood immediately how serious the danger had become. Instead of waiting to be trapped, they burst out in fury, rushing straight at the attackers. Spears flew first. Then, once distance closed, the battle turned to close fighting with blades. The struggle was savage and prolonged. Men fell in great numbers on both sides. The Thuringians were fighting for everything that made life worth defending: their land, their families, and finally their own survival. The Saxons were driven by a different force, the promise of fame and the hope of taking possession of a new country. The noise of the fight was relentless. Commands, cries of encouragement, the crashing of weapons, and the groans of the wounded blended into one continuous roar. For the whole day, the field remained locked in violence. Neither side yielded. By evening, the ground was thick with bodies, the air full of shouting and pain, and still no decision had been reached. Only the coming of darkness ended the combat. The Thuringians lost many men and saw many more wounded. The Saxons also paid dearly. Thousands of their warriors were left dead. After such losses, Irminfrid chose negotiation. He sent Iring to Theodrich with treasure and a humble embassy, hoping to obtain peace and to submit on terms before everything was lost. When Iring arrived, he spoke with great care. He described Irminfrid as a man who had once stood as Theodric's equal by kinship, and now was ready to lower himself before him. He urged the king to think not only of the defeated ruler, but also of his sister and her children, now caught in a desperate situation. As he spoke, he wept, and the appeal was strengthened by one of the Frankish commanders, a man who had already been influenced by gifts. This advisor argued that mercy would suit a king better than endless war. A humbled Thuringian ruler, he said, could become a useful dependent, loyal because he had been beaten and unable to rebel. The Saxons, by contrast, were a fierce and unbreakable people from whom no quiet future could be expected. The recent fighting had already shown how dangerous they were. Better, he suggested, to make terms with the Thuringians and then join with them to remove the Saxons. Theodrich was swayed, though not gladly. He agreed that on the following day he would receive Irminfrid and would end his alliance with the Saxons. Iring, hearing this, threw himself before the king in gratitude and praised what he called an act of mercy, worthy of a ruler. He sent the good news back to his master, giving new confidence to those shut inside the fortress. Yet he himself remained in the Frankish camp through the night, making certain that no sudden change of mind would ruin the agreement. What happened next came through chance, or something close to it. Feeling safer now that peace seemed near, a man from the fortress ventured out with his hawk to hunt along the riverbank. When the bird crossed to the opposite side, a Saxon caught it. Asked to give it back, he refused. Then the man offered information in exchange. If the hawk were returned, he said, a secret would be revealed that could save Saxon lives. The offer was accepted. The man then warned him that the two kings had come to terms, and that by morning the Saxons would be trapped or killed if they remained where they were. When the Saxon questioned whether this was truth or mockery, the answer came sharply. By the second hour of the next day, the truth would be plain enough. The only hope was to flee while there was still time. The bird was released at once, and the warning was carried back to the camp. Alarm spread quickly. Men were shaken, uncertain whether to trust the report, and divided over what should be done. In that moment of fear, leadership passed to an old warrior whose authority rested not on title, but on a lifetime of courage. He was called Hathergath, a veteran so respected that he was known as the Father of Fathers. Though advanced in years, he still carried himself with force, taking up a sacred standard marked with powerful animal symbols. He stood before the men and spoke with the certainty of someone who had long ago made peace with death. He said that age had brought him near the end of life, but had not taught him how to run. All his years among the Saxons had shown him many things, yet never had he seen his people choose flight over honour. He knew how to fight, not how to retreat, and he had no wish to learn now. If life could not be prolonged, then the sweetest end was to die beside friends. He reminded them that the bodies lying around them already gave enough proof of what their people had always been. Those who had fallen had chosen death before submission. Better, he said, to release their fierce spirits in action than surrender them to the enemy. Still, he did not speak as though offering them a fair battle. What lay ahead would be slaughter, not an even contest. Their enemies, trusting in the promise of peace and exhausted by the day's fighting, would be careless. Their guards would be weak or absent. Sleep would have made them blind. That carelessness could be turned into victory. He urged the men to follow him and promised that if his judgment failed, his own grey head could be the price. The speech transformed the camp. Fear gave way to resolve. The Saxons spent the remainder of the day eating, resting, and gathering strength. Then, during the first deep stretch of the night, when men are most heavily asleep, the signal was given. Weapons were seized. With Hathergath leading from the front, they moved against the walls and found them almost entirely unguarded. They crossed the defences, entered the fortress with a tremendous cry, and shattered the silence of the sleeping stronghold. Panic followed at once. Some of the defenders tried to flee. Others stumbled through the streets in confusion, barely knowing where they were. Some, disoriented by darkness and noise, ran directly toward the attackers, believing them to be their own people. The Saxons cut down the adults wherever they found them and took the younger captives as spoils. Through the night, the fortress echoed with shouting, killing, and plunder. No quarter of the stronghold remained quiet. Only when dawn finally broke did the chaos give way to certainty. The victory had been complete. Yet the one prize that mattered most had slipped away. Irminfrid, together with his wife, his children, and a small following, had escaped before capture. At sunrise, the victors marked the moment in the old manner of their ancestors. An eagle was set before the eastern gate, and an altar of triumph was raised. There, according to their ancient custom, they honoured the powers they believed had guided them to success. Their rites belonged to an older world, one that still shaped their identity before conversion had reached them. For 3 days they celebrated. They divided the spoils, buried their dead, and praised Hathergath as the man whose endurance and courage had carried them through disaster into victory. In memory, the date remained fixed. The beginning of October, when slaughter, triumph, and sacred ceremony were joined together in a single story. When these rites had ended, the Saxons returned to Theodric's camp. He welcomed them with praise and gave them the land as a permanent possession. From then on, they were counted as the comrades and allies of the Franks, and they made their first settlement within the fortress they had taken, preserving enough of its walls to turn it into a base of their own. But the struggle between kings did not end with the capture of the city. Earing, who had remained close to Theodric, became the instrument of a darker plan. Once Theodric learned that Irminfrid had escaped, he arranged to lure him back with promises of favour, gifts, and high rank, while keeping his own hands clear of the act that would follow. At first, Earing resisted the role prepared for him. In the end, false promises overcame him. Irminfrid was recalled and returned in hope. When he came before Theodric, he threw himself down in submission. Earing stood nearby with a drawn sword as though he were only part of the king's guard. Then, in an instant, he struck down his own lord. Theodric immediately turned on him and declared that this act had made him hateful to all men, that no place remained for him there, and that no share in such wickedness would be claimed by the king. Earing answered with bitter clarity. He admitted that he had indeed made himself hated because he had allowed himself to be ensnared by deception. But before he left, he said, he would cleanse that crime by avenging the man he had betrayed. His sword was still in his hand. Without hesitation, he turned and killed Theodric as well. Then, in a grim final gesture, he placed Irminfrid's body above the corpse of the man who had defeated him, as though granting in death the victory denied in life. After that, carving a path for himself with steel, Iring fled. Whether every detail of this story is true may be impossible to know, yet its survival in memory was so strong that his name remained attached for generations to the bright path across the night sky. After taking the land, the Saxons settled into possession of it and maintained peace for a time with the Franks. They rewarded those who had aided them and distributed land among allies and dependents. Other defeated peoples were left in place but made to pay tribute. Their own society was ordered in a distinctive way. Apart from those held in servitude, the people were divided into three great groupings by descent and law. Leadership over the whole nation rested in the hands of three principal men, each commanding military strength within his own region. These divisions were tied to the lands they occupied: the Eastern people, the Engern, and the Westphalians. In times of major war, one leader could be chosen to command the whole, and all were expected to obey him. Once the war ended, authority broke apart again, and each section lived according to its own customs and legal traditions. Other peoples also settled nearby under different laws, and over time, the relationship between Saxons and Franks did not always remain equal or smooth. Yet through all these changes, the Saxons continued for generations in the religion of their ancestors. That old world lasted until the age of Charlemagne. He was remembered not only as a ruler of immense power, but as a man convinced that such a neighbouring people should not remain outside the Christian faith. He pursued their conversion with every tool available to him, sometimes through reward, sometimes through force, and often through long years of war. At last, after decades of struggle, he achieved what he had sought. The people who had once stood beside the Franks as companions and allies were now joined to them as fellow Christians, and religion accomplished what politics alone never fully could. It made them seem, at least in the eyes of later generations, almost a single people. After the age of the great Carolingian rulers began to fade, power in the Eastern Kingdom passed through uncertain hands. The last Carolingian to rule there was Louis, son of Arnulf. He did not live long after his marriage to Liutgard, sister of Brune and Otto, the leading men of Saxony. Their father, Ludolf, had been a figure of great standing, and from that family came Brune, who governed Saxony and led an army against the Danes, but disaster overtook him before battle was joined. A sudden flood overwhelmed the army, and Brune perished with it. Leadership then passed to his brother Otto, younger in years but greater in ability and character. Louis left no son, and many among the Franks and Saxons looked to Otto as the man who ought to wear the crown. He refused it, treating kingship as a burden he would not take upon himself. By his influence, Conrad, formerly duke among the Franks, was raised to the throne instead. Yet the true balance of power remained elsewhere. Otto's authority and judgment continued to shape events even without the royal title, and his place in the political order remained unmistakable. From Otto came Henry, a man later remembered as the first independent ruler of Saxony and as one of the strongest kings of his age. Even in youth he stood out. Wisdom, self-command and practical judgment gave him distinction long before he ruled. He committed himself early to strengthening his people and preserving peace. Recognizing these qualities, his father sent him with a Saxon levy and the ducal household troops against the Dalaminzi, a people long hostile to Saxon power. Henry struck them hard enough that they sought outside help, calling in the Avars, known in later times as the Hungarians, a people feared across Europe for their harshness in war. Stories about the origins of these riders reached the medieval world in strange forms. Some believed they were descended from the Huns and ultimately tied to the Goths, peoples whose own beginnings had been traced to distant northern islands. According to one tale, women cast out from an army had been driven into an isolated wilderness, cut off by marshes and sea. There they multiplied over generations, living in a harsh and savage way, cut off from the rest of the world. Much later, while hunting, they found a path through land thought impossible to cross. On the other side, they encountered cities, walls, and settled peoples unlike anything they had known. They returned, told what they had seen, and then came back in force with families, wagons, and all they possessed. From raiders, they became migrants, devastating the lands around them, and eventually settling in Pannonia. Later tradition held that Charlemagne had once broken their strength, driven them back across the Danube, and confined them behind a great barrier to prevent further raids. But under Arnulf, that restraint failed. Old protections were undone. Political conflict reopened the route, and once again these mounted warriors poured westward. The scars they left behind were not remembered only in stories. Ruined regions and abandoned places across the Frankish world stood as visible proof of the damage they had done. To later audiences, this memory mattered because it showed the scale of the danger faced by the generations before them, and the kind of enemy that earlier rulers had confronted. When the Hungarians struck Saxony, they did not ride alone. Slavic guides led them, and the invasion brought widespread slaughter. Once laden with booty, that first force withdrew into Dalaminsian territory, only to be met there by another Hungarian army. The second group had received less support, and now threatened to turn its anger on the allies of the first, demanding equal opportunity for plunder. The result was disaster for Saxony. The land was ravaged a second time. Meanwhile, both invading forces lingered in Dalaminsia long enough to consume what the country could provide. Hunger followed in their wake so severely that the local population, stripped of sustenance, was forced to abandon home and seek survival in the service of others. With the death of the great Duke Otto, control of Saxony passed to his son Henry, a man already known for his strength, judgment, and growing authority. Otto had once had other sons, Thankmar and Liudolf, but both were gone before him, and so Henry alone inherited the full weight of his father's position. Yet the transfer of power did not happen without tension. King Conrad had already tested Henry's resolve more than once, and he was not eager to see so much influence concentrated in the hands of one Saxon duke. Because of that hesitation, anger spread through the Saxon fighting class. Conrad tried to smooth matters with careful words. He praised Otto's greatness, spoke warmly of Henry, and promised honours greater than those his father had held. But the Saxons heard little sincerity in those promises. To them, this sounded less like generosity and more like delay. Their view was simple. If the king refused to confirm Henry willingly in the office that was rightfully his, then Henry was strong enough to take what was being withheld. Conrad, for his part, understood the danger. The Saxons already regarded him with suspicion, and he knew a public war against Henry would be risky. The new duke was backed by a powerful military household and by an unusually strong levy drawn from his lands. Since open conflict offered no sure success, Conrad began to look for another path. If Henry could not be safely broken in war, then perhaps he could be removed by deception. One figure was seen as especially suited to such schemes: Hatto, Archbishop of Mainz. He had risen from modest origins, but no one doubted the sharpness of his mind. What remained uncertain was whether his cleverness served peace or destruction, because he was known as a man whose counsel could produce either. His reputation had already been shaped by a notorious episode in an earlier noble feud. At that time, a violent struggle had broken out between two powerful families. Blood had been answered with blood, and revenge had deepened into a conflict the kingdom seemed unable to control. In the middle of that chaos, Hatto was sent to restore order. He entered the stronghold of Adalbert and swore that he would reconcile him with the king and return him safely to his own lands. Adalbert accepted the pledge and invited the archbishop to share a meal as a sign of friendship and trust. Hatto refused and departed. Yet once he had passed out through the outer defences with his full escort, he is said to have stopped and lamented the journey, complaining of hunger and weariness. Hearing this, Adalbert hurried after him, begged him to return, and led him back inside to dine. Hato then considered his oath fulfilled because he had technically brought Adalbert back to his own place. Soon after, Adalbert was handed over, condemned, and put to death. That story stayed in memory because it captured the double edge of Hato's reputation. Nothing seemed more treacherous than such conduct, and yet many argued that by sacrificing one dangerous man, Hato had prevented even wider bloodshed. The same restless intelligence now turned toward Henry. According to one version of the story, Hato arranged for a golden neck ring to be made and used it as part of a plan to lure the Saxon duke to a feast, where honour and gifts would conceal mortal intent. While the piece was being crafted, Hato went to inspect it, and, on seeing it, is said to have sighed deeply. The goldsmith asked what troubled him. Hato answered that the ornament would soon be stained with the blood of a great and beloved man, Henry himself. The craftsman said nothing at the time, but once the work had been completed and delivered, he asked leave to travel and set out to find Henry. When he reached him, he revealed everything he had heard. Henry reacted with controlled fury. He summoned the messenger who had come earlier with the invitation and sent back a cold reply. He was not, he said, a man with a weaker neck than Adalbert. Better to remain at home and consider how best to serve Hato from a distance than to trouble him with a great retinue at such a feast. After that, Henry wasted no time. He moved swiftly to seize all the lands in Saxony and Thuringia that belonged to Hato. He also launched repeated attacks against Burchard and Bardo, men tied to the king's interests, one of them even by marriage. Under that pressure, they were stripped of their position, and Henry divided their property among his own followers. Hato, seeing his plans ruined and Saxon strength increasing rather than collapsing, is said to have fallen into deep grief and sickness. Within a few days he was dead. Some claimed illness took him. Others said he had been struck from heaven. However the end came, his career closed under the shadow of failure. Another tradition tells the same basic story in a slightly different form. In that version, the plot against Henry came not directly from Hato alone, but from several friends of the king. Again, a goldsmith discovered the danger when one of the conspirators came to inspect the neck ring and let slip, with a heavy groan, that it would soon be covered in Henry's blood. Once again the craftsman held his peace until the work was done, then secured permission to travel and met Henry at Castle. The Duke told him he had been invited to an honourable feast and intended to go. The goldsmith immediately warned him, and the journey ended there. Henry then thanked the king's men for their invitation, but said pressing attacks from enemies on the frontier prevented him from coming for the moment. He would remain loyal, he said, but necessity kept him away. Then he marched east, raised his forces, occupied Hato's estates throughout Saxony and Thuringia, and hammered Burchard and Bardo so relentlessly that they lost their lands as well. Those possessions too were distributed among Henry's own men. In this telling, Hato appears not as a fool, but as a talented statesman undone at the end by the collapse of his designs. He had once watched over the Frankish kingdom closely, settled many disputes, and adorned Mainz with important building works. Yet all of that could not preserve him when events turned against him. The conflict did not end there. Conrad next sent his brother Eberhard into Saxony with an army, intending to devastate Henry's duchy and force submission by violence. As the army approached the fortress of Eresburg, Eberhard is said to have spoken with dangerous confidence. His only concern, he boasted, was that the Saxons might remain behind their walls and deny him the chance to fight. He had scarcely finished speaking when the answer came. A mile from the fortress, the Saxons struck. The clash was brutal. So many Franks were cut down that the slaughter itself became the substance of later memory. What mattered most, politically, was the humiliation. Eberhard had feared he would not see the Saxons in open battle. Now they stood before him plainly enough, and his army could not withstand them. Driven off in disorder, he fled the field in disgrace. When Conrad learned that his brother had been beaten, he decided to take command in person. He gathered the full military strength of the Franks and marched out to confront Henry directly. Henry had taken refuge in the fortress of Groan, and there Conrad tried to trap him by siege. Yet even in that desperate moment, Henry was not surrounded only by walls. He had men around him who understood war in more than one form. Conrad sent a messenger offering terms. If Henry surrendered willingly, the king said, he would treat him not as an enemy, but as a friend. At this delicate moment, a man named Thietmar arrived from the east. He had great experience in military matters, possessed a quick and flexible mind, and was known for good judgment. Approaching the king's envoys, he asked where his army ought to pitch camp. Henry, hearing of this, took heart at once, believing help had truly arrived. In reality, Thietmar had come with only 5 men. But when Henry asked how many forces he had with him, Thietmar answered boldly that he could bring nearly 30 legions into the field. The messengers, deceived by his confidence and the appearance of reinforcements, returned to Conrad with that report. The effect was immediate. Thietmar accomplished by cunning what Henry had not been able to force by arms. Before dawn, the Frankish camp was abandoned, and the besieging army melted away as each man returned to his own home. Conrad then turned south into Bavaria and fought against Arnulf. During that campaign he was wounded, and from there his fortunes only worsened. Once back in his own lands, he understood that death was close and that the good fortune which once supported his kingship had left him. In that final stage, he called for his brother, Eberhard, and spoke with unusual honesty. He admitted that his life could not continue much longer and urged his brother to think not only of himself, but of the entire Frankish kingdom. The royal house, he said, still possessed all the visible instruments of power. There were soldiers, fortresses, weapons, royal insignia, and all the outward marks expected of kingship. But 2 things were missing: luck and the right kind of character. Those, Conrad believed, had passed to Henry. The true weight of public authority had already shifted toward the Saxons. For that reason, Conrad told his brother to take the sacred lance, the golden ornaments, the royal cloak, the ancient sword, and the crown, and carry them to Henry. Peace should be made with him, and a lasting settlement secured. Otherwise, Conrad warned, the Frankish people themselves would perish in resistance to a man they could no longer overcome. Henry, he said, would not merely rule one land. He would become the lord of many peoples. Eberhard, moved to tears, agreed to do as his brother wished. Soon after, Conrad died. Those who remembered him did not deny his courage. He had been strong in war, capable in government, generous in spirit, and lively in character. He possessed many of the virtues expected of a ruler, and his death was mourned widely among the Franks. Yet in the end, his own final judgment on power was clear. The future no longer belonged to him or to his house. It belonged to Henry. Following Conrad's final instructions, Eberhard went to Henry and placed both himself and the royal treasury in his hands. He made peace with the Saxon ruler and entered into a friendship that remained steady and loyal for the rest of Henry's life. Not long afterward, the leading men of the Franks gathered with the great figures of the Saxons at Fritzlar, where Eberhard publicly acknowledged Henry as king before both peoples. During that assembly, the archbishop offered Henry the sacred anointing and the crown. Henry did not reject the gesture in anger, but neither did he fully accept it. He answered with deliberate restraint, saying that it was enough for him to be called and recognized as king before his magnates through divine favour and the goodwill of the people. The oil and the crown, he said, belonged to men greater than himself, and he did not claim such honour. The words pleased the crowd. Those gathered raised their hands toward heaven and hailed the new ruler with a great cry, as if the act of recognition itself mattered more than ceremony. Once established as king, Henry moved quickly. He did not allow the kingdom to remain in the disorder he had inherited. His first campaign was directed against Burchard, Duke of Swabia. Burchard was a formidable fighter, but he was also prudent enough to judge the situation clearly. He understood that open resistance against Henry would fail. Rather than gamble everything on a hopeless struggle, he submitted himself, his strongholds and his people to the new king. That success was followed by another. Henry then marched into Bavaria, where Arnulf ruled. He found him holding out in Regensburg and laid siege to the city. Arnulf soon recognized that further resistance would bring him nothing. He came out from the city, submitted himself and his duchy, and was received with honour. Henry treated him not as a broken enemy, but as a subordinate ally whose loyalty could still be of use. From that point onward, Henry's standing grew rapidly. His authority expanded, his reputation strengthened, and the kingdom, which had been shaken by civil conflict and exposed to outside attack, began to settle under firmer control. Once he had pacified and reassembled this fractured realm, he turned outward toward the lands of Gaul and the kingdom associated with Lothar. To understand that struggle, it is necessary to look back to the old division of the Carolingian world. Lothar had been one of the sons of Louis, the son of Charlemagne, and his brothers were Charles and Louis. Their inheritance had been divided across vast territories. One ruled the western lands reaching toward Aquitaine and Gascony. Another held the eastern regions stretching toward the frontier zones beyond the Rhine. Lothar received the middle kingdom between them, the lands between the Meuse and the Rhine. Before this partition, the brothers had already fought a famous battle at Fontenoy. Yet once the division had been made, it remained stable for a time, until later inheritance again shifted power and brought several of those lands under the authority of Charles. These old arrangements did not disappear from memory. They continued to shape claims, rivalries, and loyalties long after the men who first made them were gone. Another story from that Western world helps explain the disputes Henry would later face. There had been a powerful man named Odo, remembered as brave, shrewd, and effective in war. He came to Charles and offered a plan to defeat the Danes, who had troubled the kingdom for years. The campaign that followed brought immense bloodshed upon the invaders, and Odo's name rose in consequence. He became a figure of extraordinary renown, second only to the king himself. Yet his reputation rested not only on victory, but also on the image of a disciplined and self-contained man, one who did not flaunt his power. When Charles lay dying, he is said to have asked Odo to remember the favour once shown him, and to protect any son who might yet be born to him, since the queen was still pregnant. After the father's death, a son was born and given his father's name. But the wider political reality was already changing. Arnulf, who had driven the elder Charles from power in the east, now stood as the dominant figure across the old Carolingian world. Odo received royal insignia and authority through Arnulf's favour. That moment helped create a lasting source of conflict. Rivalry continued not only between the descendants of the Carolingians and the line associated with Odo, but also between Western and Eastern powers over the lands once tied to Lothar's kingdom. It was for that reason that Henry campaigned against Charles and repeatedly defeated his forces. Fortune favoured him, but so did the instability of his enemies. Charles was eventually seized through deception by one of the great men of his own realm and held in captivity until the end of his life. Henry, when he heard what had happened, was not triumphant. He was struck instead by the uncertainty of human affairs. Charles had been a pious ruler and not without military ability, yet even such a man could be reduced to captivity. Henry, therefore, decided that direct conquest was not the only path open to him. The people of Lotharingia were known for shifting loyalties, political intrigue, and a restless attraction to new alignments. That made them vulnerable to diplomacy. Among them was a man named Christian, who had watched Henry's success and decided to secure the king's favour. Pretending illness, he summoned Giselbert, who had inherited prominence in the region after his father. Giselbert was captured by trickery and sent under guard to Henry. The king received him gladly, seeing in that one man the possibility of winning the whole duchy. Yet Henry did not keep him merely as a prisoner. He saw that Giselbert was young, able, well-born, wealthy, and capable of real influence, so he treated him generously. In time, Henry betrothed his daughter, Gerberga, to him, and joined him to the royal house by marriage as well as by political friendship. Then he entrusted Lotharingia to him. What could not be secured by force alone was stabilized through alliance. Henry's own household helped secure that growing power. His wife, Queen Matilda, renowned for her nobility and intelligence, bore him several children. The firstborn was Otto, the son on whom great expectations rested from the beginning. Another son, also named Henry, carried his father's name and would become known for energy and courage. A third son, Brune, rose to extraordinary distinction, holding both ecclesiastical authority and ducal power. Some might have questioned the combination of spiritual office and secular rule, but the age knew earlier examples of men who had exercised both sacred and public authority. Matilda also bore a daughter, who was married into one of the greatest noble houses of the West. Her own family background added further prestige to Henry's dynasty. She was descended from an old and powerful lineage associated with leaders who had fought the Danes and defended Saxony in earlier generations. Through that line, memory stretched all the way back to the great Widukind, the opponent who had resisted Charlemagne for decades. In this way, the royal house connected conquest, sanctity, noble inheritance, and the deepest traditions of Saxon identity. Not long after Henry had brought internal conflict under control, the Hungarian threat returned. Their raids swept once more across Saxony with fire, slaughter, and destruction. Cities burned, strongholds were threatened, and so much devastation was inflicted that the region seemed on the verge of collapse. At that moment, Henry chose caution over rash heroics. He remained within the fortress of Werle, unwilling to risk open battle with forces not yet fully trained for war against such an enemy. The Hungarians were swift, fierce, and practiced in a style of fighting that few in the region could yet meet confidently in the field. The damage they caused in those days was immense. Monasteries were burned, populations terrorized, and loss spread so widely that later memory struggled even to describe it. Yet from that disaster came an opportunity. One of the Hungarian leaders was captured and brought to Henry in chains. The invaders valued him highly and offered an enormous ransom in gold and silver for his return. Henry refused the money. What he demanded instead was peace. Once he had secured it, he sent the captive back with gifts and established a truce that would last 9 years. During this period, when Henry crossed the Rhine to strengthen his rule over Lotharingia, a messenger came to him from the fallen Charles. The message was full of humility. Charles, stripped of his old power and surrounded by enemies, wished above all to hear of Henry's success and to take comfort from the news of a ruler whose strength seemed still to be rising. With these words came a symbolic gift: the hand of the martyr, Dionysius, enclosed in gold and precious stones. It was offered as a token of enduring goodwill and mutual bond. The accompanying words carried a deeper message. The Franks of Gaul, it was said, now shared with Henry part of the greatest sacred comfort left to them, especially since the great martyr Vitus had long ago passed from their world into Saxony. Since the removal of that holy patron, so the messenger suggested, their lands had known civil conflict and foreign attack without end. Henry received the relic with profound reverence. He prostrated himself before it, kissed it, and honoured it as a divine gift. The memory of St. Vitus carried special meaning in Saxony. He was remembered as a noble-born youth from a pagan household, one who refused to renounce Christ even under threat and torture. His life was shaped by scenes of trial, healing, flight, imprisonment, and miraculous deliverance. A provincial governor lost the use of his hand and recovered it through the saint's prayers. Executioners were struck and then restored. His own father wavered between recognition of divine power and renewed violence. Guided away by loyal companions and heavenly warning, the boy escaped, preached, healed, and later faced imperial persecution. Wild beasts could not harm him. Flames did not consume him. Chains could not hold him beyond the reach of divine presence. In the end, after dreadful torments shared with his companions, he died in faith, and his body was buried by a noble woman in the place where he had last borne witness. Long afterward, his relics were taken first to the region of Paris and then, during the reign of Louis, transferred into Saxony. In later interpretation, this movement of sacred power came to symbolize a wider shift. As the Franks lost one of their greatest heavenly patrons, the Saxons seemed to gain strength under that same protection. By the time of Henry and his house, the idea had taken firm shape that Saxony had risen from dependency to mastery, from tributary status to leadership over many peoples. This religious interpretation of events framed the years of peace Henry had secured with the Hungarians. He did not waste them. Instead, he used that interval to reshape the kingdom's defences and prepare for future war. What he did in those 9 years became one of the foundations of his later success. First, he reorganised military settlement and local obligation. From among the rural fighting men, every 9th man was selected to live in fortified places. These men would build and occupy dwellings there, while the others continued to work the land. A portion of agricultural produce was set aside to support the garrisoned population. The arrangement ensured that strong points would be provisioned and inhabited, not left empty. At the same time, Henry ordered that law courts, public assemblies, and major gatherings should be held within these fortified sites. This gave them more than military significance. They became political and social centres as well. The men living there trained constantly, by day and by night, learning in times of peace how to act in the face of attack. Such preparation mattered because the kingdom had long possessed too few fortifications, and even those often had weak walls. Henry was not only building defences, he was changing habits, discipline, and expectations throughout the realm. Once this system was established, Henry turned his attention eastward against the Slavs, known as the Haveli. He wore them down through repeated fighting and then, in the harshest part of winter, pushed his camp onto the frozen ground. The campaign ended with the capture of Brandenburg, taken through a combination of hunger, iron, and cold. That success brought the whole surrounding region under his control. From there, he marched against Dalmatia, a land his father had once sent him to fight in his youth. At a fortress called Ghana, he laid siege for 20 days before finally taking it. The spoils were distributed among his soldiers. The adult population was put to death, while the younger captives were carried away into slavery. Afterward, Henry advanced with his whole army toward Prague, the stronghold of the Bohemians. There, he received the submission of their ruler. Stories of marvels and wonders later gathered around that king. but such tales need not stand at the centre of the political reality. What mattered was that Bohemia acknowledged Henry's superiority and was reduced to tributary status. With that achieved, Henry returned to Saxony, stronger than before and with yet another frontier brought under his authority. As Conrad had commanded before his death, Eberhard went to Henry and placed both his own loyalty and the royal treasury at the Saxon ruler's disposal. From that moment, peace was made between them, and the bond that followed remained firm and dependable throughout Henry's reign. Soon afterward, the chief men of the Franks assembled together with the leading figures of the Saxons at Fritzlar, and there, before both peoples, Eberhard openly acknowledged Henry as king. During this gathering, the archbishop stepped forward and offered him the sacred anointing and the crown. Henry responded with characteristic restraint. He did not reject the honour with contempt, but neither did he grasp eagerly at its outward symbols. He answered that it was enough for him to be named and recognised as king in the sight of his magnates through divine favour and the goodwill of the people. The oil and the crown, he said, were for men greater than himself, and he did not claim to deserve them. Those words pleased the assembly deeply. The men raised their right hands toward the sky and welcomed the new king with a great shout, as though the force of common consent mattered more than ritual display. Once Henry had been raised to kingship, he moved at once to impose order on a realm that had long been shaken by conflict. He first marched against Burchard of Swabia. Burchard was known as a fierce and capable man, but he was also prudent enough to understand when resistance would only end in ruin. Rather than risk destruction, he submitted himself, his strongholds, and his people to Henry's authority. From there, the king advanced into Bavaria, where Arnulf still held power. Henry found him in Regensburg and laid siege to the city. Arnulf soon realised that he could not prevail and came out to meet the king. He too submitted, along with his whole duchy. Henry received him honourably and kept him not as a crushed enemy, but as a subordinate ally whose loyalty could still serve the kingdom. From that point on, Henry's strength increased steadily. His prestige grew with every success, and once he had restored unity to a realm troubled by internal quarrels and external attacks, he turned his attention westward toward Gaul and the lands tied to the old Middle Kingdom. That western world still lived under the shadow of the Carolingian inheritance. Lothar had been one of the sons of Louis, the son of Charlemagne, and his brothers were Charles and Louis. The great empire had once been divided among them. One ruled the western lands reaching toward Aquitaine and Gascony. Another held the eastern territories stretching toward the Danubian frontier, and Lothar stood between them with the lands lying between the Meuse and the Rhine. Before that division had been fixed, the brothers had fought a famous and bitter battle at Fontenoy. Even after the partition, the memory of those divisions remained powerful, because later inheritances and later claims revived old rivalries again and again. These disputes were not dead matters of the past. They continued to define who believed he had the right to rule the borderlands between East and West. One figure from that Western story was Odo, remembered as both brave and politically astute. He had offered a plan to defeat the Danes who had troubled the kingdom for years, and his success made him one of the most renowned men in the realm. He was considered second only to the king, and yet his reputation rested as much on disciplined simplicity as on military success. When Charles was dying, he is said to have urged Odo to remember the favour once shown him, and to show pity toward any son who might be born after his death. Such a son did come into the world, and he received his father's name. Yet power was no longer determined by blood alone. Arnulf had already become the strongest force in the wider political order, and authority increasingly flowed through his favour. Odo obtained royal insignia and effective command through that connection. From such arrangements grew lasting conflict, not only between descendants of the Carolingians and the line linked to Odo, but also between Western rulers and the Eastern Kingdom over possession of Lotharingia. For this reason, Henry campaigned against Charles and repeatedly defeated his armies. Yet the collapse of Charles came not simply through battlefield defeat, but through treachery within his own world. He was seized by one of the leading men of his kingdom and kept in captivity until his death. Henry, hearing of that fate, did not respond with triumph. He reflected instead on the uncertainty of human fortune. Charles had possessed both piety and courage, and yet even such a ruler could be brought low. Henry therefore chose not to rely on force alone in Lotharingia. The people there were known for shifting loyalties, political manoeuvring, and a restless tendency to change sides. Instead of trying only to crush them, he sought to win them. A certain Christian, seeing that Henry prospered in all things, looked for a way to gain royal favour. Feigning illness, he lured Giselbert, who had inherited great standing in the region after his father, into a trap and sent him under guard to Henry. The king received him gladly, seeing in him a path to control the whole duchy. But Henry did not merely hold him. He observed that Giselbert was young, energetic, noble by birth, wealthy, and capable of influence. So he treated him well, gave him his daughter Gerberga in marriage, and joined him to the royal house by kinship as well as political friendship. Then Henry entrusted him with Lotharingia itself. What conquest had begun, alliance now secured. Henry's dynasty itself seemed to embody the union of strength, lineage, and sacred favour. His queen, Matilda, celebrated for her noble birth and remarkable wisdom, bore him several children. The firstborn was Otto, a son on whom immense hopes quickly settled. Another son, also named Henry, inherited both the name and much of the vigour of his father. A third, Brune, rose to extraordinary prominence, combining spiritual authority with princely power. There was also a daughter joined in marriage to one of the greatest rulers of the West. Through Matilda's own ancestry, Henry's line was connected to old Saxon greatness, to men remembered for victories over the Danes, and beyond them to the memory of Widukind himself, the great opponent of Charlemagne. In this family, the old prestige of Saxony and the new authority of kingship were joined together. Yet while Henry strengthened his kingdom within and without, one danger remained ever present: the Hungarians. Once civil wars had been calmed, they again swept into Saxony, burning fortified places, ravaging the countryside, and carrying out such slaughter that the land seemed on the brink of destruction. At that moment, Henry chose prudence over reckless glory. He held to the fortress of Werle because he did not yet trust his forces, still insufficiently trained for such warfare, to meet so savage an enemy in the open field. The devastation during those days was immense. Monasteries were burned, settlements ruined, and the scale of the calamity was so great that later memory almost recoiled from describing it. Yet from that disaster came a rare opportunity. One of the Hungarian leaders was captured and brought to Henry in chains. The enemy valued him greatly and offered an enormous ransom in silver and gold for his release. Henry refused the money. He demanded peace instead. Once a truce had been secured, he returned the captive with gifts, and thus established 9 years of peace. During that same period, while Henry was extending his authority over Lotharingia, a messenger came to him from the fallen Charles. The message was humble and full of feeling. Charles, stripped of power and surrounded by enemies, said that nothing would bring him more comfort than hearing of Henry's success and taking heart from news of his strength. Along with these words came a powerful gift: the hand of the martyr Dionysius, set in gold and precious stones. It was presented as a sign of enduring friendship and mutual bond. The implication went deeper still. The Franks of Gaul, the message suggested, had already lost much when the great martyr Vitus had passed from them into Saxony. Since that time, they had known endless civil wars and foreign invasions. Henry received the relic with profound reverence, prostrating himself before it and kissing it as a divine gift. The memory of St. Vitus held a special place in this world. He was remembered as a noble-born youth from a pagan house, a boy who refused to abandon Christ despite torture, imprisonment, and repeated attempts to break him. He healed the afflicted through prayer, survived punishments that should have destroyed him, and endured beasts, flames, chains, and torment without yielding. Guided by divine protection, he and his companions at last surrendered their souls only after every earthly cruelty had failed to conquer them. Long afterward, his relics were carried first into the lands around Paris, and later to Saxony. In later interpretation, that transfer was seen as more than a movement of bones. It seemed to mark a transfer of favour. As the Franks lost one of their greatest heavenly patrons, the Saxons appeared to rise. Their fortunes increased until they had gone from tributary status to command over many peoples. Whether understood politically or spiritually, the symbolism was unmistakable. Henry did not waste the 9 years he had secured. Those years became a time of preparation, discipline, and transformation. He knew peace would not last forever, and so he used it to reshape the kingdom's defences. From among the rural military population, every 9th man was chosen to live inside fortifications. These men were to build dwellings for the others and store a portion of the grain harvested by their neighbours. The rest would continue to sow and reap, but part of their produce was set aside to support the fortified communities. Henry ordered that courts, assemblies, and important festivals should all be held within these fortified places. In this way, they became more than military outposts. They were turned into centres of public life. There, men trained day and night, learning in times of peace what they would be expected to do when the enemy returned. The kingdom had once possessed very few proper fortresses, and even those had poor defences. Henry changed that. He created not only walls, but a whole system of habit, supply, and readiness. Once this reorganisation was underway, Henry turned eastward against the Slavs. He attacked the Haveli and wore them down through repeated fighting. During the deepest cold of winter, he established his camp on the ice itself and pressed the campaign through hunger, iron, and freezing hardship until Brandenburg was taken. With that fortress came control of the surrounding region. From there, he marched against Dalmatia, where his father had once placed him in command as a younger man. At a stronghold called Ghana, he laid siege for 20 days before capturing it. The spoils were distributed among his soldiers, while the adult population was put to death and the young carried away into slavery. Afterward, he led his army onward to Prague, the chief stronghold of the Bohemians. Their ruler submitted, and Bohemia was reduced to tributary status. Miraculous stories later gathered around that prince, but the political result mattered more than legend. Henry had extended his authority yet again. And after these neighbouring peoples had been brought into tribute, the Oberdreites, the Wildsey, the Haveli, the Dalaminzi, the Bohemians, and the Radari, and once peace seemed secure, rebellion broke out among the Radarii. They assembled a huge force and fell upon the stronghold of Walsleben. The place was captured, and everyone living there was killed in a slaughter so complete that it emboldened other barbarian nations as well. What had looked like order now threatened to unravel again. To crush this rebellion, a force was sent out, combining the expeditionary levy and professional fighting men. Bernhard, who already held authority in the land of the Radarii, was placed in command. Count Thietmar was sent alongside him as a colleague. Their orders were to lay siege to the fortress of Lenzen. For several days the siege continued, and on the 5th day, which fell on a Friday, scouts brought alarming news. A barbarian army was approaching and intended to strike the Saxon camp during the night. The report was confirmed by others, and once it was believed, anxiety spread through the encampment. Men gathered around the commander's tent, and plans were quickly made. Following counsel given in that very hour, the soldiers were ordered to remain armed throughout the night, so that no surprise assault could break them. The mood in camp was divided. Some men felt only dread, others excitement. Some feared battle, others longed for it. Hope and fear moved through the army according to the temper of each man. But as evening passed into darkness, a storm broke over the land. Heavy rain deepened the night and ruined the enemy's plan. By that sudden weather, the intended attack was thwarted. The Saxons remained armed until dawn. Then, when light began to return, the signal was given. The men received the sacrament, and after that, each swore an oath, first to the commanders and then to one another, that he would do his duty in the coming battle. When the sun rose over a clear sky, the banners were raised and the army marched out. Bernhard, positioned in the front rank, launched the first attack, but his smaller mounted force could not break through such an enormous enemy host. When he returned, he reported that the barbarians had few horsemen, but so many infantry, and stood in such terrain made difficult by the rain, that they could not easily be drawn into favourable combat. As the morning advanced, and the sun burned down on the soaked clothing of the enemy, steam rose from them into the air. That sight seemed to hearten Henry's men, who took confidence from the brightness gathering around them. Then the signal for full battle was given. The legions advanced with a great shout and struck the enemy, because the mass of the opposing force was too dense to break through directly. The Saxons hacked at them from both sides. Whenever they managed to separate groups of Slavs from the larger formation, those isolated men were cut down. As the battle intensified and the dead multiplied on both sides, the enemy still held together. At that point, Bernhard ordered Thietmar to commit support to the fight. Thietmar sent a commander with 50 heavily armed, mounted warriors against the enemy flank. That sudden blow shattered their entire formation. From then on, the battle turned into pursuit and destruction. Many fled across the fields. Some tried to reach the fortress, but were cut off and driven instead toward a nearby lake. There, sword and water together finished the work. Almost the whole mass of the enemy was either killed or drowned. None of the foot soldiers escaped. Only a few mounted men survived. The victory was total. The joy that followed was immense. Commanders were praised, soldiers praised one another, and even cowards received some share of glory, as often happens in moments of great fortune. The following day, the victors approached the fortress. Its defenders laid down their arms and asked only for their lives. That request was granted. The unarmed men were allowed to leave, but slaves, treasure, wives, children, and the goods belonging to the barbarian king were all taken captive. On Henry's side, a few notable men fell, along with others of noble birth, but the scale of victory far outweighed the loss. Bernhard, Thietmar, and the other leaders returned to Saxony in triumph, were received honourably by the king, and praised for having won so great a victory with so small a force. The captives, as promised, were executed on the next day. This military success added even greater splendour to a royal marriage, then being celebrated with magnificence. Henry gave to his son Otto the daughter of King Edmund, who was also sister to Athelstan, as wife. Through that union, Otto later had a son, Liudolf, widely loved and remembered as a man of great promise. He also had a daughter, Liutgard, who would marry Conrad, Duke of the Franks. In this way, victory in war and marriage alliance in the royal house came together, strengthening both the dynasty and its prestige. Now that Henry possessed mounted forces tested in war, he judged that the time had come to face the ancient enemy directly, the Hungarians. He summoned the whole people and addressed them in words meant to awaken memory, anger, and resolve. He reminded them that the realm had once been broken by civil war and foreign devastation. But now, through divine favour, royal labour, and the strength of the people, peace and unity had been restored. Many barbarian peoples had already been defeated and brought into service. Only one enemy remained. Against them all now had to stand together. For too long, he said, the kingdom had been plundered to fill the treasuries of these invaders. Churches and their servants had been stripped so that tribute could be paid. He then asked what should be done. Should the treasures devoted to divine worship continue to be handed over for the sake of survival? The answer from the assembled people was immediate. They raised their voices toward heaven and declared that they wished to be redeemed not by payment to the enemy, but by the living and true God. Promising full effort against so cruel a people, they raised their right hands and sealed their pledge. After this assembly had ended, Hungarian envoys came, expecting the customary tribute. They departed empty-handed. The insult was clear. The invaders did not delay. They entered Saxony with a large force and passed through Dalaminsia, seeking support from old associates there. The Dalaminsi, knowing both that the Hungarians were hurrying forward and that the Saxons were ready to fight, mocked them instead of helping them, offering only a fat dog as their so-called gift. The Hungarians had no leisure to avenge the insult, because war awaited them ahead. Pressing through Thuringia, they ravaged the land and then divided their army, one part going west, while another tried to enter Saxony from the east and south. The western column was met by Saxons and Thuringians, who killed its leaders and scattered the survivors across the countryside. Many died afterward from hunger, cold, death in combat, or captivity. It was a miserable end, fitting the hatred they had long inspired. The Eastern army learned that one of Henry's sisters was nearby in a stronghold, and that she possessed much gold and silver. She had been married to Widow the Thuringian, a lesser match because she had been born to a concubine. The Hungarians attacked the fortress in such force that they might have taken it had darkness not interrupted their effort. But during the night news reached them that their western comrades had been destroyed and that Henry himself was approaching with a powerful army. The king had established camp near a place called Riade. Struck with fear, the Hungarians abandoned their position and used fire and towering smoke signals to call together their scattered forces. At dawn, Henry drew up his army and spoke again, urging his men to place their hope in divine mercy and not to doubt the help that had already carried them through earlier battles. The enemy was the common foe of them all, and they were fighting for their land and their families. If they held firm, the Hungarians would soon flee. The speech strengthened the army. Men in the front ranks, the middle, and the rear all saw the great royal banner before them, marked with the image and name of an angel. The sight gave them fresh confidence. Henry believed, correctly, that the enemy would break as soon as they fully saw his heavily armed main force. So he placed lightly armed Thuringians forward, supported by only a small number of heavy troops, in order to draw the Hungarians onward. The plan worked. The Hungarians pursued the lighter troops, but once the main body of armoured soldiers came into view, they lost heart and fled. The pursuit lasted for miles. Few of the enemy were actually killed or captured in the chase, but their camp fell and all the captives there were freed. It was enough. Henry had finally met the Hungarians in open battle and broken the fear they had long inspired. Returning victorious, Henry offered thanks to God in every proper way for the triumph granted to him. The payments once sent to the enemy were now assigned to the support of the church, and gifts were distributed to the poor. The victory transformed his reputation. He was hailed as father of the fatherland, lord of the world, and emperor in all but title. News of his strength spread far and wide, and kings and great men from other lands sought his favour and friendship. Among them came Heribert, brother-in-law of Hugh, because King Raoul had attacked him despite all custom and law. Heribert asked Henry for protection against his own lord. Henry was not a man who turned away the appeal of a friend. He therefore marched into Gaul, spoke with the king, settled the matter, and returned to Saxony. Within his own land, Henry made it a point to exalt his people. There were few distinguished men in Saxony whom he did not reward with gifts, offices, or positions of responsibility. He was renowned for prudence and wisdom, but these qualities were matched by the power of his body, which added visible majesty to his kingship. In military exercises and games, he surpassed nearly everyone. In the hunt, he showed such skill that on one occasion he killed more than 40 wild beasts. Even in feasts and lighter moments, he never diminished his royal dignity. He knew how to inspire both affection and fear among his warriors, and held those two forces in such balance that even when he was playful, those around him never dared forget who he was. At last, after subduing so many neighbouring peoples, Henry turned north and defeated the Danes, who had harassed the Frisians with raids from the sea. He forced them into tribute and compelled their king, Cnuba, to receive baptism. Having overcome enemies in every direction, Henry then began to think of a journey to Rome. But illness overtook him before that plan could be carried out. When Henry understood that he was gravely ill, he summoned the whole people and named his son Otto as king after him. To his other sons he distributed goods and treasures, but over them all he set Otto, the eldest and the best, as ruler over his brothers and over the Franks. Once his testament had been made properly and his affairs arranged, he died as the greatest king of Europe, unmatched in strength of spirit and body. What he left behind was more than sons and treasure. He left a son greater even than himself, and he left a vast empire not inherited, ready-made from his father, but built through his own effort and granted, as later memory would see it, by God alone. He had lived 60 years and reigned 16. His body was carried by his sons to Quedlinburg, amid the tears and mourning of many peoples, and there he was buried in the Basilica of St. Peter before the altar. To the noble Lady Matilda, daughter of an emperor and one of the most powerful women of her age, this work turns with humility and purpose. What follows is not a simple beginning, but the continuation of a great effort, one that has been carefully shaped, refined, and brought forward with the hope that it will be worthy of her regard. The strength and influence of her house stretch far beyond a single land, touching distant regions and commanding respect across continents. It is with that awareness that this narrative seeks her favour. If anything within it falls short of excellence, it is trusted that her wisdom and generosity will overlook its faults, allowing the work to endure as it was first intended. A faithful and devoted account. After the death of Henry, remembered as a father to his people and a king of rare strength, the choice of a successor was swift and decisive. The leading men of the Franks and Saxons turned to his son Otto, who had already been marked out for rule during his father's lifetime. The gathering that confirmed this decision was held at Aachen, a place deeply tied to the memory of earlier emperors. There, within a grand basilica associated with imperial tradition, the nobles assembled in great number. As Otto entered, the dukes, counts, and commanders raised him onto a throne set within the sacred space. One by one, they offered their hands, swore loyalty, and pledged to stand beside him against any enemy. In that moment, authority was not only inherited but publicly confirmed through the united will of the realm. While this act unfolded, the clergy moved in solemn procession through the church, marking the occasion with ritual and prayer. the archbishop approached Otto and guided him forward, presenting him before the gathered people. Standing where all could see, he declared that Otto had been chosen by divine will and confirmed by the leading men of the kingdom. At this, the crowd responded as one, raising their hands toward the heavens and calling out for the new king's prosperity and success. It was a moment where sacred ceremony and popular acclamation merged into a single powerful statement. The ritual continued at the altar, where the symbols of kingship had been prepared. Otto stood dressed in the traditional attire of his people as the archbishop presented each object in turn. The sword was placed in his hands as a sign that he must defend the realm and uphold justice. A cloak followed, reminding him of the responsibility to maintain peace and order. Then came the scepter and staff, symbols of authority tempered by mercy, calling on him to rule with discipline, but also compassion, especially toward the vulnerable. Finally, he was anointed with holy oil and crowned, marking the completion of the sacred rite. When all was done, he was led to a high throne from which he could see the assembled people, and they in turn could look upon their new ruler. The ceremonies did not end within the church. After the rites were completed, the king moved to the palace, where a great feast had been prepared. There, in a display of order and tradition, the great dukes themselves took on ceremonial roles, serving at the royal table as a sign of their submission and loyalty. Each carried out a specific duty, reflecting an older system that linked power with service. The arrangement showed that even the most powerful men in the kingdom stood beneath the authority of the crown. When the celebrations concluded, Otto rewarded each of these leaders with generous gifts, reinforcing bonds that were as much personal as they were political. Yet even as these ceremonies unfolded, unrest was already stirring beyond the borders. Among the neighbouring rulers, ambition and rivalry were never far away. One of these figures, Boleslav, seized power through violence, killing his own brother, a man known for his devotion and faith. Fearful of losing control, he turned against neighbouring rulers who maintained ties with the Saxons. When one of these threatened leaders sought help, Otto responded by sending forces to support him. Among these troops was a unique group formed under Henry's earlier policies, a force composed in part of men who had once lived outside the law, but had been reshaped into soldiers and settled near key strongholds. These men, hardened and desperate, proved effective in battle. When the armies met, Boleslav showed skill and cunning. He divided his forces and struck at the advancing Saxon and Thuringian troops separately. One group fled in panic when confronted unexpectedly, but another, under a determined commander, pressed forward and achieved a sharp victory. However, success bred carelessness. As the soldiers scattered to gather spoils and rest after the fight, Boleslav regrouped his forces and launched a sudden counterattack. The unprepared Saxons were overwhelmed, their commander killed, and the army destroyed. With this victory, Boleslav advanced further, capturing a stronghold and leaving devastation in his wake. The conflict did not end quickly. It stretched on for years before he eventually became a loyal subordinate of the king. Otto did not allow such setbacks to weaken his resolve. When he received news of defeat, he remained steady, drawing strength from his belief in divine support. He led his army across the frontier, determined to restore order. Along the way, he appointed new commanders, seeking men of ability and loyalty. Yet even these decisions stirred jealousy among his followers. Rivalries grew, and some withdrew from service, while others acted recklessly in pursuit of glory. One such figure, driven by ambition, attacked the enemy without orders and paid for it with his life. Despite these losses, Otto continued his campaign, defeating his enemies and forcing them once again into submission. The Hungarians soon returned, testing the strength of the new king. They entered through Franconia, hoping to strike into Saxony from the west. Otto moved quickly to meet them, and his response was enough to force them into retreat. But as often happened in times of external threat, internal divisions soon followed. The Saxons, strengthened by recent victories, began to resist authority from outside their own ranks. Disputes escalated into violence, and rival leaders took matters into their own hands, attacking strongholds and killing their enemies without royal approval. Otto responded firmly, but not without restraint. Those responsible for these acts were punished, sometimes harshly, yet he remained open to reconciliation. Even those who had acted against him could find mercy if they submitted. This balance between authority and forgiveness defined much of his rule, though it did not always prevent further unrest. Conflicts over law and inheritance added to the tension, leading to assemblies where disputes were settled not only through judgment, but sometimes through combat, reflecting the harsh realities of the age. The greatest danger, however, came from within the royal family itself. Thankmar, a son of Henry from an earlier union, felt wronged and turned against his half-brother Otto. Joined by powerful allies, he raised a force and captured strongholds, spreading disorder across the land. Otto moved swiftly to confront him, laying siege to his positions. In one dramatic moment, Thankmar sought refuge within a church, but even there he was not spared. Pursued by soldiers, he was struck down near the altar, his rebellion ending in blood. Otto, though angered by the actions of his troops, could not fully punish them as the wider conflict still raged. Another challenge soon emerged from Otto's own brother, Henry. Influenced by ambitious allies, he entered into a conspiracy aimed at seizing power. Though he returned to the king under the appearance of loyalty, unrest continued to grow. Campaigns and counter-campaigns followed, with fortresses changing hands and alliances shifting rapidly. At one point, Henry fled with only a handful of followers, taking refuge in a stronghold before being forced to surrender. A temporary peace followed, but it was fragile. Beyond these internal struggles, the eastern frontier remained unstable. Slavic tribes resisted Saxon control, launching raids and seeking independence. One royal commander, Gero, responded with ruthless efficiency, eliminating enemy leaders through deception and force. Yet the conflict dragged on, fueled by the determination of those who preferred hardship and freedom over submission. The Saxons found themselves surrounded by enemies on all sides, and the struggle became one of endurance as much as conquest. In the midst of this prolonged conflict, diplomacy and treachery also played their part. A Slavic leader named Tugumir, persuaded by promises of wealth, betrayed his own people. He gained their trust, then eliminated a rival and handed over his lands to the king. This act triggered a chain reaction, leading other groups to submit rather than face destruction. Gradually, the frontier stabilized, and the influence of the Saxon kingdom extended further east. After leaving Saxony behind, Henry returned once more to Lotharingia and stayed for a time with his brother-in-law, Duke Giselbert. Otto didn't allow that alliance to grow unchecked. He led another campaign into the region, ravaging the countryside with fire and forcing the Lotharingians back under his authority. Giselbert, pressed hard and shut up inside the fortress of Chievremont, managed to slip away before the trap closed around him. Yet Otto could not fully take the place. The stronghold was too difficult to storm, and the siege dragged without result. So, after laying waste to the surrounding lands and reasserting his power in the region, he turned back towards Saxony. Otto understood that brute force alone would not end this struggle. Giselbert had around him men whose influence mattered as much as walls and weapons, and among them one name stood out: Immo. He was known as a clever and dangerous man, quick-witted, hard to deceive, and fully capable of surviving in a world shaped by shifting loyalties. Otto decided it was wiser to turn that cunning to his own advantage than to spend more lives trying to break Lotharingia by direct assault. Immo saw the balance of power clearly and chose not to remain tied to a losing side. He broke with Gislebert and took up arms against his former lord. That betrayal struck Gislebert deeply, not only because Immo had once been useful, but because he had long been trusted. The insult grew sharper through one of those strange episodes that seem almost too theatrical to be true, yet survive because they capture a man's character so well. A herd of Gislebert's pigs happened to pass by Immo's stronghold. Immo had a piglet chased inside through the open gate, and the rest of the herd followed after it. Once the animals were inside, the gates were shut and the whole herd was taken. Gislebert could not ignore the humiliation. He raised an army and laid siege to Immo, determined to recover both his authority and his dignity. But Immo met him with trickery again. He had beehives broken apart and hurled down at the mounted attackers. The enraged bees stung the horses into panic and nearly threw the riders into chaos. Then, while the confusion spread, Immo and his men threatened a sortie from the walls. Gislebert, frustrated and repeatedly outmatched by stratagem rather than force, finally gave up the siege. As he withdrew, he is said to have admitted the full weight of the loss. When Immo had once stood beside him, keeping Lotharingian loyalties intact had seemed easy. Now, even with all Lotharingia behind him, he could not bring down a single man standing alone. While Gislebert was being weakened in this way, Eberhard at last abandoned any appearance of restraint. The war had lasted too long for neutrality, and he chose his side openly. Breaking faith with the king, he rejoined Gislebert and once again entered the struggle as his ally. Together they went beyond defending the western lands and crossed east of the Rhine to ravage the countryside there as well. News of this reached Otto while he was besieging Breisach and other places still loyal to Eberhard. At that moment, many who had stood by the king lost confidence and drifted away, no longer certain that Saxon power would endure. Otto's position looked fragile. Even men close to him faltered. The archbishop abandoned the royal camp, leaving behind tents and supplies. Yet Otto himself remained unshaken. With only a small force still around him, he behaved as though the crisis had changed nothing. He gave no outward sign of fear, and that steadiness itself became one of his greatest weapons. The reasons for the desertion of certain churchmen were left clouded, whether from caution, politics, or the limits of what could safely be said. What mattered in practice was that the archbishop had gone to speak with Eberhard about peace and settlement, and in doing so had bound himself to an agreement the king had never authorized. Otto refused to be constrained by decisions made without his approval. The breach that followed was serious. The archbishop left the royal presence and went away as though into exile, while another bishop was sent off elsewhere. In such moments, rebellion and diplomacy blurred together, and even men of the church became actors in the struggles of princes. The conflict was finally decided, not through endless manoeuvring, but through sudden disaster. Duke Hermann was sent out with an army to crush the rebellious dukes. He found Eberhard and Gislebert along the Rhine at a vulnerable moment when much of their army had already crossed the river with plunder. Eberhard was caught in the fighting and surrounded. He did not die easily. He resisted fiercely, receiving blow after blow and striking back as long as he could, until at last a spear brought him down. Gislebert tried to escape. He fled to a boat crowded with other men, but the vessel could not bear the weight. It sank beneath them, and he drowned in the river. His body was never recovered. In a single stroke, the rebellion lost its two greatest leaders. When the news reached Otto, he gave thanks to God, whose help he believed had so often sustained him in danger. He placed the government of Lotharingia in new hands, entrusting it to Otto, son of Richwin, who was to guide the region and watch over the young Henry, the son of Gislebert and the king's sister, a child still thought to have a future. Then, the king returned to Saxony. But victory was not followed by ease. Henry, Otto's brother, withdrew from Lotharingia and went west into the lands once ruled by Charles. The same season that saw the death of the rebel dukes was followed by a bitter winter, and after that came famine. In such times, even triumph carried a heavy cost. Not every disturbance ended with the Great Rebellion. Imo himself later took up arms against the king, though it was not entirely clear whether his hostility was real, temporary, or part of some shifting calculation. In the middle of winter, his stronghold was surrounded, and he surrendered both himself and his fortress. From then on, he remained useful and loyal. Others tied to Gislebert also submitted. His nephews, Ansfrid and Arnold, entered the king's service and were allowed to retain the strongholds they had held. Yet even here the story turned again through deceit. Imo, restless and ambitious, sent them a message designed to stir resentment. He claimed that he had no interest apart from theirs, that they were the true leaders of the people, and that men acting together were always stronger than one man standing alone. Why? He asked. Should they continue to serve the Saxons except because their own divisions had made them weak? He spoke bitterly of how he had once abandoned a great lord and taken up with the Saxons, only to find himself rewarded not with honour, but with insult and near servitude. He offered an alliance, even proposing marriage between his daughter and Ansfrid to prove his sincerity. His words were carefully chosen, and despite long distrust, they began to believe him. A meeting was arranged. Imo had armed men hidden nearby. When the moment came, both men were seized and sent to the king under guard. Along with them came a message describing one as pliable and the other as hard as iron, suitable for the harshest questioning. Otto punished them at first by holding them in captivity. But as so often in his reign, severity gave way to calculated mercy. Once he believed their loyalty could be secured, he released them in peace. This whole sequence reflected the tangled reality of the time. Events overlapped, loyalties shifted, and causes were not always cleanly separated from consequences. Order could be restored, but rarely through simple or honourable means. In the midst of all this, Otto showed compassion toward his brother Henry, who had now suffered enough to seem more broken than dangerous. The king granted him several fortresses for his own use and allowed him to remain among the Lotharingians. But while Otto worked to heal divisions within his family, trouble continued elsewhere. Along the frontier, Gero was carrying the burden of a hard and bitter war against the Slavs. The men serving under him had been worn down by endless campaigning. Tribute had stopped flowing, pay and plunder had diminished, and resentment spread through the ranks. Hatred directed at Gero began to spill over onto the king himself, who continued to support him for the sake of the realm. Henry saw this bitterness and used it skillfully. Men already made sour by hardship were easily drawn toward promises of change. Through gifts, messengers, and quiet persuasion, he won over many of the soldiers in the eastern regions. Soon the conspiracy grew so bold that a plan was laid to murder the king during Easter, while Henry was present at court, and then place the crown on his head. No one openly betrayed the plot. Yet before the feast arrived, word of it somehow reached Otto. Believing himself preserved by God, he took precautions without showing fear. Loyal soldiers guarded him day and night, yet he allowed none of this to diminish the public dignity of the holy days. Outwardly, he remained every bit the king. Inwardly, his enemies knew they had failed. After Easter, Otto moved quietly. He took counsel with trusted men, especially powerful Franks then, with him, and ordered the conspirators to be seized or killed. The first to fall was Eric, a man who, apart from this final treason, had built a reputation for courage and noble conduct. When he realized armed men were closing in, he mounted his horse, armed himself, and chose death rather than submission. He was struck down by a spear. Others involved in the plot were held for a short time and then executed according to the law, most of them by beheading. Henry alone escaped. He fled the kingdom. That same year, strange signs were said to have appeared in the heavens. Comets were seen for days, and many believed they foretold plague, upheaval, or a change of ruler. Men remembered other wonders said to have appeared before the death of Henry the Elder, and so fear spread easily. Stories circulated of sunlight turning blood red through windows, of fire appearing upon the mountain where the old king was buried, and even of a severed hand being restored almost whole after long healing. Whether these things were signs from heaven or only stories magnified by fear. They entered memory alongside the political crisis itself. Soon after, floods came, and then disease among cattle, as though the natural world too had entered into the turmoil. In Lotharingia, power had to be reorganized yet again. With the death of Otto of Verdun and of the young Henry he had been meant to guide, the ducal office passed to Conrad, the man later called the Red. He was joined more firmly to the royal house through marriage to the king's daughter. Conrad was intelligent, brave, effective in both civil and military matters, and known for the kindness he showed to his soldiers. At the same time in Bavaria, Berthold governed after the death of Arnulf and won fresh renown by defeating the Hungarians. Otto himself, meanwhile, continued to expand his authority. He campaigned into Burgundy, brought its king beneath his influence, and forced another Hugh into submission. Among the trophies and gifts that came from these victories was a jewelled golden brooch of remarkable beauty, remembered long afterward. At last, after so many wars, Otto was moved to reconcile fully with his brother. Their holy mother urged him toward mercy, and Henry, worn down by hardship and failure, was ready to receive it. Once Berthold died, Otto gave Henry Bavaria. Peace between the brothers was restored, and unlike earlier settlements, this one lasted. Henry remained loyal for the rest of his life. He was married to the daughter of Duke Arnulf, a woman praised for both beauty and intelligence. The harmony between the two brothers was pleasing to those around them, and useful to the realm. Together they enriched the state, defeated enemies, and ruled their peoples with firm paternal authority. Henry proved energetic in Bavaria. He campaigned successfully, captured Aquileia, defeated the Hungarians more than once, crossed the Ticino, seized great quantities of booty from enemy lands, and brought his army safely home. The fuller character of the two brothers invited admiration. Otto, as elder and ruler, stood out for piety, endurance, generosity, and remarkable loyalty to friends. Even men accused of crimes sometimes found in him an advocate rather than a destroyer. After the death of Queen Edith, he learned to read with real competence, something he had not mastered earlier. He could understand books, speak both Romance and Slavic tongues, hunt, ride, and carry himself with the visible force of kingship. His body itself seemed made for rule, large, powerful, and marked by striking features that left an impression on everyone who saw him. Henry, by contrast, seemed sterner and less approachable, though those who knew him well found him loyal and constant. He too inspired affection, especially through his appearance and bearing. The youngest brother, Brune, combined intellect, learning, energy, and virtue to such a degree that he became one of the most remarkable men of his age. Set over the Lotharingians, he imposed such discipline that order and peace began to take root in a land long torn by violence. As civil wars and invasions receded, other tensions rose in their place. In these years, monks began to suffer increasing pressure, especially from bishops who believed monasteries should be stricter, smaller, and more tightly controlled. Some thought weak men should leave rather than remain within monastic life, without real zeal. Others saw in these policies not reform but political motive. One prominent abbot, Hadamar of Fulda, became a central figure in these disputes. He was respected for learning, industry, and for rebuilding the great church of Fulda after fire had destroyed it, making it more splendid than before. Yet conflict with high churchmen did not spare even him. A bishop under his supervision, already guilty of conspiracy more than once, was first kept honourably, then more harshly when letters were discovered that deepened suspicion. Once released, that same bishop sought revenge. He acted against monasteries great and small, yet ultimately his efforts failed. Hadamar retained the king's grace, and that royal protection was enough to frustrate his enemies. Meanwhile, in the west, trouble struck Otto's sister. She had borne 3 sons to King Louis, but Louis himself was betrayed by his own commanders and captured with the help of the Northmen. He was brought to Laon and held there publicly. One of his sons was taken away to Rouen and died there. When Otto heard what had happened to his brother-in-law, he was deeply troubled and began planning an expedition against Hugh for the following year. At roughly the same time, envoys or hostages sent by Boleslav were displayed before the people, while the king was hunting, a sign that even old enemies were now yielding tokens of submission. Then came one of the heaviest blows of Otto's personal life: the death of Queen Edith. Her passing was felt as a calamity throughout Saxony. She had been born of royal English blood and was honoured as much for her piety as for her lineage. For 10 full years she had shared in the burden of rule, and in the 11th she died. She had spent 19 years in Saxony and left behind 2 children, Liudolf and Liutgard. Liudolf was already seen as a youth of exceptional promise, strong in both spirit and body. Liutgard would later marry Duke Conrad. Edith was buried facing east in the new basilica at Magdeburg, and her death was mourned with tears across the land. In that grief, the public and the private worlds of kingship came together once again. A mighty kingdom still endured, but one of its brightest figures had been lost. After the passing of Queen Edith, the king's world changed in a deeply personal way. The affection he had once given to his wife now settled entirely upon his only son, Liudolf. The boy became the centre of his hopes, and before long the king made his intentions clear. Arranging his affairs with care, he chose Liudolf as the future ruler of the realm. Yet this decision carried a quiet uncertainty. The young heir had not yet reached full maturity, still standing at the edge of manhood, untested by the weight of true command. Despite this, events did not pause to allow him time to grow. The king soon turned his attention westward, setting out on a campaign into Gaul. His army gathered strength as it moved, and from Cambrai he pressed forward with urgency. His purpose was clear: to avenge the humiliation suffered by his brother-in-law, King Louis. Word of this advance spread quickly, and Hugh, who held great power in the region, responded with arrogance rather than caution. Through a messenger, he boasted that he would raise a force greater than any the king had ever seen. He mocked the Saxons openly, claiming they were weak in war and that he could overcome them with ease. The king answered not with anger, but with a cutting remark that carried its own quiet confidence. He declared that Hugh would soon see more warriors than he could imagine, and when the army advanced, it did so in overwhelming numbers. The host was vast, filled with ranks upon ranks of soldiers, moving as a single force across the land. The sight alone was enough to shake confidence. Before any great clash could unfold, fear began to work its way through Hugh's position. Faced with the reality of the king's strength, he released Louis rather than risk destruction. With this achieved, the king continued his advance. He reached Laon and prepared to take it by force. From there, he moved toward Paris, tightening pressure on Hugh and demonstrating that resistance would bring only ruin. Along the way, he honoured the memory of Saint Denis with solemn reverence, showing that even in war, devotion held its place. Then, the army turned toward Reims, where disorder had taken hold within the church itself. A bishop had been forced into position unjustly, while the rightful holder had been cast aside. The king acted swiftly. The city was taken, the illegitimate authority removed, and order restored. The campaign did not end there. Selecting a strong and capable force from among his men, the king pushed further, marching toward Rouen, a place long tied to northern raiders and shifting loyalties. But here, the land itself became an enemy. Harsh weather, difficult terrain, and the slow grind of winter began to wear down the army. After months of effort, the campaign could go no further. Though still strong, the army withdrew, returning to Saxony without completing its final objective. The cities that had been secured along the way were entrusted to Louis, restoring his position and strengthening his rule. Hugh, having seen the king's power firsthand, no longer sought confrontation. The following year, before another invasion could begin, he came forward to meet the king. The meeting took place beyond a river, where he submitted himself and entered into an agreement on the king's terms. From that moment, he remained loyal, having learned the cost of defiance. While these events unfolded, Ludolf himself was stepping into a new stage of life. The king arranged a marriage for him with a noble and wealthy bride, strengthening his position further. Not long after, the death of his father-in-law placed even greater authority in his hands, granting him lands and influence. But with power came change. The calm nature he had shown in youth began to give way to ambition. He gathered a force and led it into Italy, capturing cities and leaving garrisons behind before returning north. It was a bold move, but one that hinted at a growing independence. At the same time, Italy itself was in turmoil. A ruler named Berengar had seized control, ruling harshly and placing profit above justice. He feared the presence of a powerful widow, a queen whose strength and reputation threatened his hold on power. He sought to weaken her by every means, hoping to reduce her influence or remove her entirely. Meanwhile, the king turned again toward Bohemia, leading a campaign against Boleslav. Advancing with strength, he captured a key fortress, where even Boleslav's own son had been trapped within the walls. Yet instead of pressing recklessly for total destruction, the king chose restraint. He understood the dangers of pushing his men too far in pursuit of spoils. Seeing the overwhelming strength of the army before him, Boleslav chose submission over ruin. He came forward, acknowledged the king's authority, and received mercy. The campaign ended in complete success, and the king returned home in triumph. Not long after, the king's attention returned to Italy, though his purpose extended beyond war. He set out under the appearance of a pilgrimage, but his true goal lay elsewhere. The queen who'd been threatened by Berengar now stood at the centre of his plans. Upon reaching Lombardy, the king sought her favour through gifts and careful approach. Once her loyalty was secured, he married her, uniting power with legitimacy. The city of Pavia, a royal seat, fell under his control. This decision, however, struck Ludolf deeply. Seeing his father take a new wife and secure new alliances, he withdrew in silence, leaving the court in sorrow. He returned to Saxony and remained there for a time, distancing himself from the shifting balance of power. After the marriage, the king returned to his homeland in full royal splendour, bringing with him both celebration and renewed authority. Berengar followed soon after, seeking peace. He was received with formal honour, though not immediately granted access to the king. Days passed before he was allowed to speak, a delay that stirred resentment among those close to the court. Suspicion grew, particularly among Ludolf and others, who believed that hidden rivalries were shaping events. In time, Berengar was granted favour. He accepted the authority of the king and agreed to formal terms that would bind him in loyalty. At a great assembly, these promises were renewed publicly. Father and son stood together, pledging service, and were then dismissed in peace. Yet even as these agreements were made, nature itself seemed to echo the intensity of the moment. A violent storm broke over the gathering, with thunder and hail so fierce that many believed it to be a sign beyond ordinary understanding. The king's household continued to grow. From his new marriage came sons and a daughter, strengthening the future of the dynasty. Yet beneath this outward success, tension remained. Whispers of betrayal began to spread. As the king travelled through his lands, he learned that his own son and son-in-law were plotting against him, preparing ambushes along his path. Though the truth was hidden at first, the danger became clear before it could be carried out. The king acted with caution and resolve. He surrounded himself with loyal guards, maintaining his authority without showing fear. When confronted, those accused sought to explain themselves, claiming necessity rather than treachery. For a time, the king accepted their words, not out of trust, but because circumstances left him little choice. Yet the conflict did not end there. Soon after, the fragile peace broke. The king demanded that those responsible be handed over. When this was refused, the divide became open and undeniable. What followed was not merely rebellion, but something deeper and more tragic, a struggle between father and son. The war reached a turning point at Mainz. The city became a focal point of resistance, with Ludolf inside its walls and the king outside, each representing a different claim to authority. The siege was fierce and prolonged. Engines were brought forward, walls were battered, and fighting raged without decisive outcome. Both sides hesitated, bound by fear as much as by duty. The soldiers outside faced their king, while those within defended his chosen heir. Negotiations began, offering a brief hope of peace. Ludolf and his ally came forward, humbling themselves before the king, offering submission in exchange for mercy for their followers. But trust had been broken too deeply. The king demanded accountability, and when it was refused, the fragile peace collapsed. Soon after, events shifted again. Forces moved toward Bavaria, and Ludolf seized control of key strongholds, distributing wealth among his men and driving out those loyal to his uncle. The conflict widened, drawing in new allies and deepening divisions across the realm. Even as the king pursued his son, his own position weakened. Many abandoned him, leaving only a handful of loyal supporters. Yet, he did not falter. Hardened by struggle, he pressed forward, driven by a belief that his authority came not from men, but from a higher power. The war continued across regions, drawing in Saxons, Bavarians, and even foreign forces. Battles were fought without clear victory, sieges dragged on, and the land itself suffered under the weight of destruction. Fields were burned, cities strained under siege, and the people endured the cost of ambition and rivalry. In one of the fiercest moments, the city of Regensburg became the centre of conflict. The king's army surrounded it, cutting off escape and pressing the defenders to the edge. Inside, the situation grew desperate. Rather than wait for hunger to claim them, the defenders chose action. They launched a daring plan, combining cavalry and river forces in a coordinated attack. But the element of surprise was lost. The attackers met resistance the moment they entered the enemy camp. And what followed was chaos, as both sides clashed in a struggle where neither could claim easy victory. Panic spread quickly among the attackers. Surrounded and overwhelmed, many tried to escape, but there was no clear path to safety. Some rushed toward the ships in desperation, only to lose their direction in the chaos and disappear beneath the river's current. Others managed to reach the vessels, but too many climbed aboard at once, causing them to capsize. In the end, almost no one from that large force survived the disaster. Outside the walls, the mounted troops fared no better. They were steadily driven back by the king's cavalry, their strength fading under relentless pressure. Wounded and exhausted, they retreated toward the city gates. The royal forces, having broken their resistance, returned to camp in triumph. From the entire clash, they carried back only a single man who had been fatally struck near the entrance. Meanwhile, beyond the city, a large herd of cattle had been grazing in the fertile land between two rivers. This herd was seized by the king's brother, Henry, and divided among his followers. Within the city, the defenders now faced not only the strain of battle, but the growing threat of hunger. As conditions worsened, Liudolf attempted to seek peace. He left the city accompanied by leading men and presented himself in hope of reconciliation. But his request was denied. He had refused to submit fully to his father's authority, and without that submission, no agreement could be reached. Forced to return inside, he resumed the fight. Soon after, he launched an attack against one of the king's commanders, a seasoned warrior who had achieved victory in many campaigns. The fighting that followed was fierce and relentless, lasting for hours beneath the heat of the day. During the struggle, a rider fell before the gates, struck down along with his horse. It was Arnulf, a man of noble standing. Stripped of his armour and surrounded, he was killed by a storm of spears. His death remained uncertain at first, only confirmed days later by a desperate woman who fled the starving city. The loss shook the defenders deeply. With their strength failing and morale shaken, they finally became ready to accept terms. Once again, intermediaries stepped forward to negotiate. Liudolf emerged from the city a second time, this time under greater pressure than before. The siege had dragged on for weeks, and the strain could no longer be ignored. A temporary peace was granted, allowing time for a final judgment to be made at a later assembly. With this agreement in place, the king withdrew and returned to Saxony. But the conflict had left its mark. Soon after, Henry secured control of the newly expanded part of the city. That same night, disaster struck. A fire broke out and spread rapidly, consuming much of Regensburg and leaving destruction in its wake. In time, the struggle between father and son reached a turning point. While the king was engaged in a hunt, Liudolf approached him in humility. Barefoot and overcome with remorse, he threw himself at his father's feet. His words were filled with regret, and his tears moved not only the king, but all who witnessed the moment. The anger that had divided them gave way to compassion. The king accepted him once more, restoring him to favour on the condition that he would remain loyal and obedient. Not long after, news arrived that a high-ranking bishop had fallen gravely ill and was near death. This delayed important decisions, but once he passed, a great assembly was held. Order was restored across the region, and those who had once stood against the king returned to his service. From that point onward, they remained faithful. At the same time, conflict continued beyond the core of the kingdom. In the eastern lands, Gero led campaigns against the Slavs, achieving victory and bringing back great wealth. His success strengthened Saxony and reinforced the king's authority. The king soon returned to Regensburg with renewed determination. This time, the city could not hold out. With supplies gone and no hope of relief, the defenders surrendered. The leaders were punished with exile, but the rest were spared. The region was restored to the king's brother, securing stability once more. Yet a greater threat soon emerged. The Hungarians, long feared across Europe, advanced again into the kingdom. At first, they appeared as envoys, but their true intentions became clear. The king wasted no time. Despite the exhaustion of recent wars, he gathered his forces and marched to meet them. Near Augsburg, the armies prepared for battle. the king's forces were drawn from many regions, forming a powerful but diverse host. Among them stood seasoned warriors and younger soldiers eager to prove themselves. Opposite them, the Hungarian army waited, confident in its mobility and skill with the bow. The battle began with sudden violence. The enemy struck from behind, targeting the rear of the army and throwing it into confusion. Units were scattered, supplies seized, and many men cut down. For a moment, defeat seemed close, but the king reacted swiftly. He sent reinforcements to stabilize the line, and a fierce counterattack drove back the attackers. What had begun as chaos turned into a decisive struggle. The king then addressed his men, urging them to stand firm. He reminded them that they fought not in distant lands, but in their own homeland. Retreat was not an option. Strength, faith, and resolve would decide the outcome. With renewed determination, the army advanced. The king himself led the charge, raising his shield and sacred standard as he rode forward. The enemy resisted at first, but once their lines began to break, panic spread among them. Some fled into nearby settlements, only to be trapped and burned within. Others tried to escape across the river, but were unable to climb its banks and drowned. By the end of the day, their camp had fallen and captives were freed. The destruction continued over the following days as the remaining enemy forces were hunted down and eliminated. The victory was complete, though not without cost. Among the fallen was Duke Conrad, a brave and respected leader. Exhausted by the heat of battle, he had loosened his armour and was struck by an arrow. His death was mourned deeply, and his body was carried home with honour. Captured leaders of the enemy were executed, their fate serving as a warning. The king, now victorious, was celebrated by his army as a great ruler. His triumph echoed across the lands, restoring confidence and ending a long period of fear. Following this victory, his reputation grew even further. Envoys arrived from distant regions, bringing gifts and seeking alliance. Exotic animals and rare treasures were presented, symbols of the respect he commanded across the world. Yet even in victory, loss remained. Liudolf, seeking to remain loyal to his companions, left his homeland and travelled to Italy. There, after a year of campaigning, he died. His passing was a heavy blow, not only to his father, but to the entire realm. His body was brought back and laid to rest with honour, while sorrow spread among the people. The king received news of his son's death while still on campaign. Though deeply affected, he remained steadfast, continuing his duties with faith and determination. Meanwhile, unrest persisted in the northern regions. Wichmann, ever restless, returned and stirred further conflict, aligning himself with foreign powers. Though some of his allies were captured and executed, he managed to escape and continued his resistance. Elsewhere, a remarkable event unfolded among the Danes. Though they had long followed their own traditions, a debate arose about faith. A priest stepped forward to defend his belief in a single true God. To prove his conviction, he carried a piece of burning iron without injury. This act astonished those who witnessed it. The Danish king accepted the faith and ordered his people to abandon their old practices, marking a turning point in their beliefs. Back in the east, Gero continued his campaigns, subduing rebellious groups and expanding the reach of the kingdom. Victory came at a cost, but it secured dominance in the region. Conflicts among local rulers added further instability. Rival leaders turned against one another, drawing in allies and deepening divisions. Wichmann once again became involved, seeking advantage in the chaos. But his plans often unravelled, leaving him isolated. In one final episode, a fortified stronghold became the centre of struggle. Surrounded and cut off, its defenders faced hunger and despair. Attempts at negotiation failed, and the situation turned desperate. When the garrison finally emerged, weakened and overwhelmed, the conflict ended in harsh punishment and loss. After the fall of the stronghold and the punishment of his allies, Wichman turned away from the lands he once knew and moved east again. There, he sought refuge among foreign tribes, joining a Slavic group determined to challenge a rising regional power that stood loyal to the emperor. Their plans were no secret, and word quickly reached their intended enemy. In response, that ruler called upon his powerful ally through marriage ties and secured mounted reinforcements to strengthen his position before the coming clash. When Wichman advanced with his army, the defending forces did not meet him with full strength at once. Instead, infantry units were sent forward, engaging just enough to draw him in. Step by step, they retreated, giving the impression of weakness while carefully pulling Wichman farther away from his secure base. Then, at the right moment, mounted troops struck from behind. At the same time, the infantry, which had appeared to be withdrawing, suddenly turned and advanced. Wichman found himself trapped between two forces, pressed from both sides. Realizing the danger, he attempted to escape, but his own men, seeing him turn his horse, accused him of abandoning them. Forced to dismount, he returned to the fight on foot. That day, he fought with determination, shielded by his armor and driven by the will to survive. Yet the struggle did not end there. By the next morning, exhaustion had taken its toll. He and a small group sought refuge in a nearby building after marching through the night under constant pressure. Hungry, worn down, and still fully armed, they had little strength left. It was there that enemy leaders discovered him. Recognizing from his equipment that he was no ordinary warrior, they demanded his name. When he identified himself, they urged him to surrender, promising to take him safely to their ruler and ensure his return to imperial authority. But Wichman refused. Even in that moment, surrounded and weakened, he would not submit under such conditions. Instead, he declared that he would only surrender to their lord directly. While messengers went to fetch him, a growing crowd gathered, hostile and restless. They attacked without restraint. Though exhausted, Wichman struck back fiercely, cutting down several of his attackers. At last, seeing that the end was near, he raised his sword and handed it to one of the stronger warriors among them. He asked that it be delivered to their lord as proof of victory, and from there passed on to the emperor. His message was clear. His death might be seen as the fall of an enemy, but it should also be mourned as the loss of a man bound by blood and shared history. With that, he turned eastward, spoke a final prayer in his own tongue, and gave up his life. His death marked the end not only of his own struggle, but of many who had taken arms against the emperor. When news reached the ruler, confirmed by the return of Wichman's weapons, it brought certainty to what had long been feared. Orders were then sent across Saxony, informing military leaders and officials of the situation and outlining the path forward. At that time, the emperor stood strong, with his influence extending far beyond his own lands. Envoys from distant realms arrived, seeking peace and offering gifts. Negotiations with Eastern powers hinted at new opportunities, while plans were set in motion for future campaigns. The emperor made it clear that rebellion would not be tolerated and that those who had repeatedly broken their word would face decisive action. Yet events did not unfold without complication. Agreements made with distant allies were soon broken. Unexpected attacks followed, catching imperial forces off guard. Fortresses were destroyed, and many lives were lost or taken captive. In response, the emperor sent trusted commanders with a powerful army to restore order. Their campaign was swift and brutal. The enemy, overconfident from earlier success, fell into their hands. Many were killed, others captured and punished, before being sent back as a warning. Victory brought both wealth and renewed authority. Meanwhile, unrest spread even within distant capitals. Internal betrayal led to the fall of a ruler, replaced by another who quickly sought peace. Captives were released, alliances restored, and a marriage was arranged to strengthen ties between great powers. Celebrations followed, and for a moment, stability seemed within reach. But even as political fortune shifted, personal losses struck deeply. The emperor's mother, a woman of remarkable character and devotion, fell gravely ill. Known for her humility and tireless acts of kindness, she had spent her life serving both her people and her faith. Her days were filled with prayer, charity, and quiet strength. She cared for the sick, aided the poor, and welcomed all who came to her. Her presence brought comfort to many, and her death left a profound void. Not long after, other respected figures also passed away, adding to the sense of loss that spread through the realm. Yet despite grief, the emperor continued his work, returning from distant campaigns to restore order at home. His victories had secured vast territories, defeated powerful enemies, and strengthened his rule across Europe. As he travelled through his lands, he was met with both celebration and sorrow. Loyal subjects gathered to welcome him, while news of further deaths reminded all of the passing of an era. Still, his authority remained unshaken, and his reputation had grown beyond anything seen in generations. In his final days, he followed the same disciplined routine that had defined his life. Rising early, attending prayers, giving to the poor, and sharing meals with those around him, he showed no sign that the end was near. But during an evening gathering, as voices rose in song, his strength suddenly failed. Those close to him rushed to his side, supporting him as he weakened. After receiving the final rites, he passed peacefully, without struggle, surrounded by the sounds of prayer. His death was announced to the people, and grief spread quickly. Yet alongside sorrow came remembrance. He was praised as a ruler who had protected his people, defeated their enemies, and brought stability to a turbulent age. His victories over distant invaders, his campaigns across foreign lands, and his efforts to strengthen faith and order were recalled with admiration. By morning, attention turned to the future. His son, already recognized as heir, was once again affirmed by the people. Leaders and warriors pledged their loyalty, swearing to defend him and continue the legacy that had been built. The body of the emperor was carried to the city he had made his own, laid to rest with honor and ceremony.